Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there are names that echo across the void like distant thunder, names that carry with them the weight of countless dead worlds and the screams of billions. Among the Imperium's endless list of threats and terrors, one name stands apart, spoken in hushed tones by those who have witnessed the green tide firsthand and survived to tell the tale. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, the beast of Armageddon, the prophet of the green gods, the oldest living orc warboss in the galaxy, and perhaps the most dangerous being alive in the 41st millennium. To understand why this name carries such weight, why entire Imperial Guard regiments have been sacrificed just to slow his advance, why Space Marine chapters have mobilized their full strength to face him, we must first understand what makes Ghazghkull different from the countless other orc warbosses who have risen and fallen like waves against the shore of the Imperium's vast territories. The Greenskins are, by their very nature, creatures of the moment. They live for the fight, for the thrill of battle, caring nothing for history or legacy. They do not plan beyond their next meal, their next brawl, their next conquest. They are a tide of violence, unstoppable in their fury, but ultimately directionless, burning bright and hot before fading into obscurity as quickly as they emerged. But Ghazghkull is different. Ghazghkull has vision. He sees not just the battle before him, but the war that stretches across centuries. He sees not just his tribe or his clan, but every orc in the galaxy united under a single banner, are moving with singular purpose toward a destiny written in the stars themselves. He claims to hear the voices of the orc gods, Gork and Mork, whispering their will directly into his mind through the adamantium plate that now forms a significant portion of his skull. Whether this is genuine divine inspiration, the result of psychic awakening, or simply the delusions of a brain-damaged orc, matters little in the end. What matters is that Ghazghkull believes it with every fiber of his being, and that belief has transformed him into something the galaxy has not seen in 8,000 years. The Imperium's greatest scholars and strategists have studied Ghazghkull's campaigns with a mixture of academic fascination and existential dread. They have watched as he has done what was thought impossible, a binding orc clans together, not through brute force alone, but through something that approaches true leadership. They have witnessed tactical sophistication that rivals the greatest human generals, strategic planning that extends across decades, and a charisma that can rally billions of greenskins to a single cause. In an empire where orcs are typically dismissed as little more than a savage nuisance, Ghazghkull has forced the Imperium to confront a terrifying truth. The greenskins are not just capable of thinking. In the right hands, they are capable of winning. This is the story of how a lowly orc boy, his skull shattered by a Space Marine's bolter round, became the greatest threat to the Imperium since Horus himself turned traitor. This is the story of battlefields littered with the dead from a dozen wars, or of worlds burning beneath the green tide, of an enemy who cannot be reasoned with, cannot be negotiated with, and who will not stop until every star in the galaxy echoes with the roar of orc war cries. This is the story of Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, and why, 10,000 years into humanity's long struggle for survival, he might be the one who finally brings it all crashing down. Our story begins not in the grand halls of terror or amidst the gleaming spires of an imperial hive city, but on a backwater world called Urk, a planet whose very name would become synonymous with the rise of the greatest orc warlord the galaxy has ever known. Urk was not always the desolate, war-torn rock it would eventually become. Once, in ages past, it had been a hub of interstellar trade. Its position in the galaxy making it a natural crossroads for merchant vessels traveling the warp lanes between more prosperous systems. Ships from a dozen different species would stop at Urk to resupply, to trade, to rest before continuing their journeys through the dangerous void. But the warp is fickle, and warp lanes are not permanent things. Over time, the routes that had made Urk so valuable shifted, moving to bypass the planet entirely. The merchants stopped coming. The trading posts fell into disrepair. The other species abandoned Urk to its fate, leaving behind only ruins and the scattered remnants of civilizations that had once thrived there. Into this vacuum came the orcs, as they always do, drawn by some unknowable instinct to places where war and conflict might be found. They settled on Urk, not because it was a good world or a rich world, but simply because it was there and no one else wanted it badly enough to fight them for it. For centuries, perhaps even millennia, Urk became nothing more than another orc-held world, remarkable only in its unremarkability. The greenskins there fought among themselves as orcs do, their endless clan wars providing the violence and conflict they craved without threatening anyone else. The Imperium, stretched thin across 1,000,000 worlds and fighting 1,000 wars, was content to let them be. Occasionally, when the orcs on Urk grew too numerous or too organized, the Dark Angels Space Marine chapter would conduct what they called culling operations, raids designed not to conquer the planet, but simply to reduce the orc population to manageable levels, yet to break up any large gatherings before they could become dangerous. It was during one of these raids, 9 years before what would become known as the Second War for Armageddon, that everything changed. The Dark Angels had struck at an orc settlement with their characteristic efficiency, their bolters roaring as they cut down wave after wave of greenskins who charged at them with more enthusiasm than sense. Among the automated defenses the Space Marines had left behind were weapon systems designed to continue the fight even after the Dark Angels themselves had withdrawn, turrets and drones that would harry the orcs and keep them disorganized. In the chaos of the battle, a young orc boy, recently spawned and barely old enough to hold a weapon, found himself caught in a crossfire he didn't understand. He was nothing special. He was just another face in the green tide, another expendable body in an endless war. His name, such as orcs have names before they earn glory, was simple and unremarkable. He belonged to the Goth clan, known for their love of close combat and their black war paint, but he had not yet distinguished himself in any way that would mark him for greatness. He was, in every measurable way, completely and utterly ordinary. Then, in a moment that would reshape the galaxy, a bolter round found him. The mass-reactive shell, designed to penetrate armor before exploding, struck him directly in the skull. The impact was catastrophic. Approximately 30% of his skull simply ceased to exist, reduced to fragments by the explosive force. His brain, that primitive but resilient organ that makes even an ordinary orc a dangerous creature, was pulped and shredded. By every reasonable measure, he should have died instantly. No creature, not even an orc with their legendary toughness, should have survived such a wound. But the orcs are not reasonable creatures, and their biology defies easy categorization. The young orc did not die. Instead, driven by an instinct he did not understand, he staggered away from the battlefield, one hand pressed against the ruins of his skull, trying to keep his brain from spilling out onto the dirt. He stumbled through the settlement, past other wounded orcs who were either dying or recovering at the remarkable speed that greenskin physiology allows. He walked, one foot in front of the other, until he collapsed outside a ramshackle structure that served as the workshop of the settlement's painboy. And the painboy in question was known as Mad Doc Grotznik, and even among orcs, a species not known for their stability or sanity, Grotznik had a reputation for being dangerously unhinged. Where other painboys were content to patch up wounds and occasionally graft on new limbs looted from the dead, Grotznik saw each patient as an opportunity for experimentation. He was obsessed with what he called surgery, a concept that bore only passing resemblance to actual medicine and far more similarity to creative butchery. Other orcs avoided him when they could, preferring to trust their own regenerative abilities rather than submit to Grotznik's tender mercies. But the young orc had no choice. He had collapsed on Grotznik's doorstep, and when the Mad Doc found him there, he saw not a dying patient, but an opportunity. Well, here was an orc whose skull had been catastrophically damaged, whose brain was exposed and ruined. Here was a chance to try something new, to push the boundaries of what was possible, to create something that had never existed before. Ghazghkull dragged the unconscious orc into his workshop, laid him out on his blood-stained surgical table, and went to work with the kind of manic enthusiasm that would have horrified any trained physician. The surgery took hours, far longer than any orc procedure typically required. Ghazghkull worked with an attention to detail that was utterly unlike him, guided by an inspiration he did not question. He salvaged what he could of the original skull, reinforcing it with metal plates and surgical staples. But the damage was too extensive for simple repair. Nearly a third of the skull needed to be replaced entirely, and Ghazghkull had just the thing. In a corner of his workshop, he had a sheet of adamantium, that nearly indestructible metal prized throughout the galaxy for its strength and resilience. Where he had obtained it, no one knew and no one dared ask. But Ghazghkull shaped it, molded it, and grafted it directly onto the orc's skull, creating a metal plate that would protect the brain beneath. The brain itself was another matter. So much tissue had been destroyed that there was no way to replace it all. Ghazghkull worked with what remained, trimming away the damaged portions, reconnecting severed neural pathways in ways that made sense only to him, installing a crude bionic eye where one of the original eyes had been lost. Yet he worked until exhaustion threatened to overtake even his enhanced orc constitution, then worked some more, driven by a compulsion he did not understand. Finally, as the Urk's sun rose on a new day, Ghazghkull stepped back from his work. The orc on the table should have been dead a dozen times over. The surgery itself should have killed him if the original wound hadn't. But somehow, impossibly, the patient's chest continued to rise and fall with shallow breaths. Ghazghkull, satisfied with his work in the way only a mad genius can be, turned away to clean his tools. It was perhaps an hour later when the orc's eyes snapped open. The one remaining organic eye, bloodshot and wild, focused on nothing and everything. The bionic replacement whirred and clicked as it adjusted to the light. The orc sat up slowly, testing limbs that should not have worked, moving a body that by all rights should have been a corpse. He raised one hand to his head, felt the cold metal of the adamantium plate, traced the surgical scars that crisscrossed his skull, and then he heard them. The voices, Gork and Mork, the twin gods of the orcs, speaking directly into his mind with a clarity that defied description. They told him that he had been chosen, that his near death had been a test, that he had been broken so that he could be remade into something greater. They showed him visions of a united orc empire stretching across the stars, of every greenskin in the galaxy fighting under a single banner, of a crusade so vast that it would shake the foundations of reality itself. They told him that he was to be their prophet, their instrument, the one who would gather the scattered orc clans and forge them into an unstoppable tide. Whether these visions were real or hallucinations born of his traumatic injury, whether the voices were truly divine or simply the result of rewired neural pathways creating patterns in static, whether Mad Doc Ghazghkull's surgery had somehow awakened latent psychic powers or simply driven the young orc completely insane, none of these questions mattered. What mattered was that the orc believed. With every fiber of his being, with a certainty that burned brighter than any star, he believed that the gods themselves had spoken to him and given him a sacred purpose. When he stood and walked out of Ghazghkull's workshop, he was no longer a nameless orc boy who had nearly died in a pointless skirmish. He was Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka, which in the brutal orcish tongue meant something like Metalhead Great Orc Leader, though the full name carried nuances of meaning that did not translate well into Gothic. He was the prophet of Gork and Mork, the chosen one, the leader who would unite the greenskins and lead them to glory. The other orcs, who had known him before as just another boy, saw something different in him now. It was in the way he carried himself, no longer hunched and uncertain, but standing tall with absolute confidence. It was in his eyes, one organic and one bionic, which seemed to look not at the present, but towards some distant future only he could see. It was in his voice, which no longer hesitated or wavered, but spoke with the authority of one who knows without doubt that he is right. Within days, orcs who would normally have challenged such presumption from a young warrior instead found themselves following him, drawn by a charisma that could not be explained but could not be denied. But Ghazghkull understood, with a wisdom that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, that charisma alone would not be enough. The gods had given him vision and purpose, but he would need to prove himself worthy of both. He would need to demonstrate that he was more than just another orc with grand delusions. He would need to show that he could fight, that he could win, that he could lead, and the perfect opportunity to do exactly that was walking around Urk right now, completely unaware that his days were numbered. The current ruler of the settlement where Ghazghkull lived was a warboss named Dregmek, a member of the Deathskulls clan, known for their blue war paint and their habit of looting anything that wasn't nailed down, and quite a few things that were. Dregmek was old by orc standards, meaning he had survived long enough to grow to an impressive size and accumulate a respectable number of scars. He ruled through a combination of brute strength and the loyalty of his most powerful warriors, and until now, no one had seriously challenged his authority. Ghazghkull waited, not out of fear, but out of patience, a trait almost unheard of among orcs. He spent his days gathering followers, orcs who were drawn to him by his growing reputation and his absolute certainty about the future. He spoke to them of the visions Gork and Mork had shown him, of worlds burning beneath the green tide, of an empire that would span the stars. Some dismissed him as mad, damaged by his head wound and speaking nonsense, but others listened, and what they heard struck a chord deep within their primal souls. As Ghazghkull's following grew, so too did his reputation for being different from other orcs. He did not lead his warriors in mindless charges against the nearby settlements. He did not waste their lives in pointless feuds or stupid brawls. Instead, he drilled them, organized them, taught them to fight with discipline that was shockingly un-orc-like. When they did fight, it was with purpose, striking at specific targets for specific reasons. They won more often than they lost, and the loot they brought back was distributed fairly rather than hoarded by Ghazghkull himself, which earned him even more loyalty. Eventually, inevitably, and Dregmek noticed that one of his subordinates was getting ideas above his station. The old warboss could have crushed this upstart immediately, could have used his superior size and strength to remind everyone who was in charge. But Dregmek made a mistake, one that would prove fatal. He assumed that because Ghazghkull was smaller and younger, he would be weaker. He assumed that this prophet nonsense was just the ravings of a brain-damaged orc who had gotten lucky a few times. He assumed that he could take his time dealing with this minor annoyance. He assumed wrong. One day, without warning or fanfare, Ghazghkull simply walked into the center of the settlement and challenged Dregmek directly, publicly, in front of every orc who called Rustspike home. He did not shout or threaten or posture. He simply stated that Dregmek was wasting perfectly good warriors fighting automated defenses left behind by the Space Marines, that the gods wanted Urk's orcs to do greater things, and that Dregmek had proven himself unworthy to lead them into their destiny. Dregmek, enraged by this insult to his authority, did exactly what Ghazghkull expected him to do. He ordered his warriors to open fire, to cut down this insolent fool where he stood. Cannons roared, shooters blazed, and enough firepower to obliterate a tank was directed at Ghazghkull's position. But something impossible happened. Every single shot missed. Whether through incredible luck, unconscious psychic manipulation, or genuine divine intervention, not a single bullet or shell found its target. Ghazghkull stood in the middle of a storm of fire and emerged completely unscathed, while all around him the ground was torn apart by impacts. The other orcs, witnessing this miracle, fell silent. Even Dregmek's most loyal followers began to wonder if perhaps this prophet was telling the truth. If perhaps Gork and Mork truly were protecting him. If perhaps they were backing the wrong boss. But Dregmek, too angry and too proud to back down now, charged at Ghazghkull with his power claw raised, intent on tearing the young upstart limb from limb. What followed was less a fight than a systematic dismantling. Ghazghkull did not trade blows with Dregmek, did not meet force with force. Instead, he moved with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for an orc, dodging attacks that would have killed him, striking at weak points in Dregmek's armor, and wearing down the older Warboss through countless small injuries rather than trying to land one killing blow. He fought with a cold calculation that was completely unlike typical orc behavior, treating the battle as a problem to be solved rather than an opportunity for glorious violence. Hours passed. Dregmek, frustrated and bleeding from a dozen wounds, began to slow. His power claw became heavier with each swing, his reactions dulled by exhaustion. Ghazghkull, by contrast, seemed as fresh as when the fight had started, his bionic eye tracking every movement, his adamantium skull protecting him from blows that would have killed another orc. Finally, inevitably, Ghazghkull saw his opening. With a move so fast that watching orcs barely saw it happen, he struck Dregmek directly in the throat. It then followed up with a series of blows that reduced the old Warboss to little more than a pile of meat. As Dregmek's corpse hit the ground, Ghazghkull raised his arms and declared himself the new boss of Rustspike. He announced his intention to unite all of Urk under his rule, to bring every clan and every settlement together for a purpose greater than any they had known before. And then, as if the gods themselves approved of his words, something miraculous happened. The sky lit up with brilliant green light as a nearby supernova painted the heavens with emerald fire. The orcs, already awed by what they had just witnessed, took this as a sign that their new boss was indeed favored by Gork and Mork. But Ghazghkull knew that one victory, no matter how impressive, would not be enough. Urk was divided among several major warbosses, each commanding their own clan, each jealously guarding their territory and their warriors. If Ghazghkull wanted to unite the planet as the gods had commanded, he would need to deal with each of them in turn. And so began a campaign that would last months, a systematic conquest of Urk that would become the template for everything Ghazghkull would do in the centuries to come. His next target was the Bad Moons clan, led by a warboss named Snazdaka, who ruled over a vast territory known as the Big Wasteland. The Bad Moons were rich by orc standards, their yellow war paint marking them as the wealthiest of the clans. They had the best weapons, the finest armor, the most impressive vehicles. Their battle wagons, painted in garish yellow and covered in enough guns to level a city block, were the envy of every other clan, while Snazdaka himself rode in one of these mighty machines, and he was convinced that his superior firepower would make short work of this upstart prophet. Ghazghkull approached the conflict with the Bad Moons differently than most orcs would have. Rather than simply charging headlong into Snazdaka's guns, he studied the terrain, planned his approach, and struck where the Bad Moons were weakest. He used tactics that seemed almost un-orc-like in their sophistication, employing feints and ambushes, focusing fire on key targets rather than shooting at everything that moved. When Snazdaka's battle wagons rumbled out to meet him, Ghazghkull had his warriors target the vehicle's weak points, the treads, and the fuel tanks, disabling them before they could bring their massive firepower to bear. The battle was brutal, but relatively short. Almost one by one, the Bad Moon's vehicles were reduced to burning wrecks. Snazdaka, watching his advantage evaporate, realized too late that he had been outmaneuvered by an opponent who was supposed to be his intellectual inferior. When Ghazghkull's warriors finally closed in, the Bad Moons fought with courage, but could not overcome their disadvantage. Snazdaka himself fell beneath the green tide, and his warriors, seeing their boss defeated, swore allegiance to Ghazghkull. In a gesture that would become characteristic of his approach to conquest, Ghazghkull did not simply absorb the Bad Moons into his own forces. Instead, he allowed them to retain their clan identity, their yellow war paint, their pride in their superior equipment. Or he ordered the remaining mechs to take the wreckage of Snazdaka's finest battle wagon and forge from it an enormous power claw, which he gave to the strongest of the Bad Moon's warriors, as a symbol that they were now part of something greater. This gesture of respect earned him loyalty that simple force never could have achieved. Next came the Snakebites, the most primitive of the Orc clans, who rejected new technology and preferred to fight with crude weapons and war beasts. Their leader, Warboss Grudbolg, was ancient even by Orc standards, his body covered in scars from centuries of warfare. Grudbolg was stubborn in the way that only the very old can be, convinced that his way was the right way, and that this young prophet was nothing but trouble. He refused to submit, even when it became clear that Ghazghkull commanded superior numbers and better organization. The campaign against the Snakebites lasted an entire week, 7 days of brutal fighting through the rough terrain they called home. Grudbolg fought with a savagery that earned even Ghazghkull's respect, refusing to surrender even when defeat became inevitable. Ghazghkull was forced to decapitate the old Warboss twice, the first time not enough to keep him down, as Grudbolg's legendary toughness allowed him to keep fighting with his head hanging by a thread. Only on the second decapitation, when Ghazghkull made sure to separate head from body by a considerable distance, did Grudbolg finally acknowledge defeat. Even then, the old warrior's last words were to praise Ghazghkull's strength and swear that his clan would follow this new boss wherever he led. The Goths, Ghazghkull's own clan, were next. Their leader, a massive orc named Ugrak, challenged Ghazghkull to a traditional headbutting contest, the kind of simple, straightforward test of strength that Goths loved. Ghazghkull, despite being smaller than Ugrak, accepted without hesitation. The two orcs stepped forward, backed up, and charged at each other with skull-cracking force. The impact was so powerful that Ugrak was literally driven a foot into the ground, knocked completely unconscious by the force of Ghazghkull's adamantium-reinforced skull. When Ugrak finally regained consciousness hours later, he swore immediate allegiance, impressed by any orc who could hit that hard. One by one, the remaining war bosses of Urk fell in line. The evil sons, obsessed with speed and their red war paint, were impressed by Ghazghkull's tactical mobility. The Blood Axes, the most cunning of the clans who were willing to use actual strategy rather than just hitting things, recognized in Ghazghkull a kindred spirit who understood that sometimes you needed to think before you fought. By the time Ghazghkull's campaign was complete, every major clan on Urk had sworn allegiance to him, and he had created what he called the Council of Clan Bosses, a leadership structure that allowed each clan to maintain its identity while working toward a common goal. But even as Ghazghkull consolidated his control over Urk, events beyond his control were already in motion. The planet's sun, already old when the first orcs had arrived, East was entering the final stages of its life. Solar flares, growing larger and more frequent with each passing week, began to scour the planet's surface with deadly radiation. Orcs, hardy as they were, began to die in large numbers from exposure. The settlements that had stood for generations became death traps, their crude shelters offering no protection from the star's deadly rays. The other war bosses, faced with this existential threat, would have simply fought over the remaining safe areas until there was nothing left. But Ghazghkull saw the dying sun differently. He saw it as a sign from Gork and Mork, a message that it was time to leave Urk behind and begin the great crusade the gods had shown him in his visions. He gathered all the orcs of Urk and told them that the time had come to paint the stars red with blood, yes, to take their war to the rest of the galaxy, to fulfill their destiny as the chosen warriors of the greenskin gods. The orcs, inspired by his words and desperate to escape the dying planet, threw themselves into preparing for the exodus with manic enthusiasm. But there was one small problem. They had no ships, no way to leave the planet, no means of traveling through the void between stars. Any other leader would have seen this as an insurmountable obstacle. Ghazghkull saw it as merely another problem to be solved. He set the orcs to work building crude rockets, hastily assembled contraptions that had maybe a 50-50 chance of reaching orbit before exploding. Dozens of orcs died testing these devices, but orcs do not mourn their dead, and for everyone who perished in a failed launch, 10 more were eager to try. Then, as if in answer to Ghazghkull's prayers, the solution to their problem appeared in the sky above Urk. A massive space hulk, one of those vast conglomerations of ships and debris that drift through the warp, emerged from the Imperium on a course that would take it past the dying planet. These hulks were dangerous places, often infested with demons or worse, but to the orcs, they represented salvation. Here was a vessel, ready-made and available, large enough to carry every orc on Urk and more besides. Ghazghkull ordered an immediate assault on the space hulk. The crude rockets, designed to barely reach orbit, were now tasked with matching velocity with a massive object moving through space at thousands of miles per second. Most of them failed, exploding or missing their target entirely. But enough succeeded, and orc boarding parties began to cut their way into the hulk's exterior, forcing entry through airlocks and breaches in the hull. They entered expecting to find a derelict vessel, empty and ready to be claimed. Instead, they found that the space hulk was very much occupied. The interior of the hulk was a nightmare realm, twisted corridors that seemed to shift and change, walls that bled when touched, air that screamed with voices that were not quite sounds. Demons of chaos had claimed the space hulk as their own, using it as a staging ground for raids into real space. Lesser orcs would have fled in terror, overcome by the sheer wrongness of the place. But Ghazghkull's warriors, bolstered by their faith in their prophet and their own savage courage, pushed forward room by room, corridor by corridor, fighting creatures that should not exist against odds that should have been impossible. For days, the battle raged throughout the space hulk's vast interior. Ghazghkull himself led from the front, his adamantium skull protecting him from demonic attacks that would have driven a lesser being mad. He fought with a fury that seemed to inspire even hardened orc veterans, cutting down demons with his power claw, rallying his warriors when they began to falter.
You know, I have to pause here for a moment because there's something about Ghazghkull that genuinely fascinates me as someone who's been reading Warhammer for quite a while. Most orc war bosses are just big angry greenskins who hit things until they stop moving, right? But Ghazghkull is different in a way that's actually kind of terrifying when you really think about it. What gets me is that he's patient, an orc being patient. That's like finding a perfectly organized tax return from a corn berserker. It just shouldn't happen. But here's this guy who got his skull blown apart, woke up hearing gods in his head, and instead of just immediately charging at the nearest enemy, he spent years carefully building his power base, learning tactics, and studying his opponents. And honestly, that's what makes him so much scarier than any other orc in the setting. He's not just strong, he's smart. He's not just lucky, he's strategic. The Imperium has dealt with orcs for 10,000 years, but they've never had to deal with an orc who thinks like this. But anyway, let's get back to the story.
Pushing ever forward toward the Hulk's bridge and the warp engines that kept it moving through reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of fighting, Ghazghkull and his inner circle reached the heart of the Space Hulk. There, in a chamber that hurt to look at directly, they found a massive warp rift, and a tear in reality through which demons continued to pour into the material world. This was the source of the infestation, the reason the Hulk was so thoroughly corrupted. Any sane being would have retreated, called for assistance, tried to seal the rift through ritual or technology. Ghazghkull, demonstrating either supreme confidence or absolute insanity, simply walked up to the rift and headbutted it closed. The exact mechanics of how this worked, if indeed it worked at all, were never clear. Perhaps the adamantium in his skull, being a material of the physical world, was able to somehow disrupt the energies that held the rift open. Perhaps the sheer force of Ghazghkull's will, channeled through his connection to the orc gods, was sufficient to impose reality on unreality. Perhaps it was simply that the universe, Faced with an orc too stubborn to accept that something couldn't be done, simply gave up and let him do it. Regardless of the why, the rift collapsed, the demonic presence began to fade, and the Space Hulk was finally theirs. Ghazghkull named the Hulk World Killer, a promise and a threat in equal measure. The orcs of Urk, those who had survived the boarding action, began the massive task of making the Hulk spaceworthy. They scavenged materials from the planet's surface, stripped every settlement down to bare metal, worked with a manic energy driven by the knowledge that Urk's sun would soon make the planet uninhabitable. Mechs worked around the clock, their bizarre understanding of technology producing results that defied conventional physics. Slowly, the Space Hulk began to change, transformed from a derelict drift into something that, while it would never be called beautiful or even functional by Imperial standards, could at least move with something approaching purpose. When the last orc had boarded, when Urk's surface had become too irradiated for even greenskin biology to withstand, Ghazghkull gave the order to depart. The World Killer's ancient engines, coaxed back to life by orc ingenuity and liberal applications of percussive maintenance, roared to life. The massive vessel, kilometers long and made of fused ships from a dozen different civilizations, began to move, pulling away from the dying planet and accelerating toward the warp translation point. The journey through the warp was nightmarish, even by the standards of those who regularly travel through that hellish realm, the World Killer's Gellerfield. The protective barrier that shields ships from the warp's corrosive influence was barely functional, patched together from components that had never been designed to work together. Multiple times during the journey, the field failed completely, exposing sections of the Hulk to the raw stuff of chaos. Demons, drawn by the psychic beacon of so many orc souls, attacked repeatedly, forcing the greenskins to fight for their lives even as they traveled between stars. But these constant battles, rather than weakening Ghazghkull's horde, only made them stronger. Each successful defense reinforced the orcs' belief that they were truly chosen by Gork and Mork, that their prophet was leading them to glory. The warriors who survived these warp attacks became hardened veterans, and when the World Killer finally emerged from the Imperium near the Armageddon system, Ghazghkull commanded an army that had been forged in the literal fires of hell. Armageddon. The name would become synonymous with some of the most brutal warfare the galaxy had ever seen. But when the World Killer first appeared in the system, it was just another Imperial world, important for its industrial capacity and strategic location, but not exceptional in any particular way. The planet's defenses, designed to repel typical orc raids, were hopelessly unprepared for what was about to descend upon them. Orbital satellites, decades old and barely maintained, opened fire on the Space Hulk as it approached, their weapons having approximately as much effect as throwing rocks at an approaching mountain. The World Killer's own weapons, and a hodgepodge of salvaged Imperial, Orc, and completely unidentifiable systems, returned fire with enthusiasm, if not accuracy. Orbital defenses exploded, communication satellites were vaporized, and the small fleet of system defense ships that tried to intercept the Hulk were swatted aside like annoying insects. Within hours of arriving in the system, Ghazghkull had achieved complete orbital superiority, and there was nothing the defenders could do to stop what came next. A month later, on the day of the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, in the year 941 EMS 41, the orcs descended. They came in a green tide, hundreds of landing craft and improvised drop pods screaming through the atmosphere, many exploding from the stresses of re-entry, but enough surviving to deliver their cargo of howling greenskins to the planet's surface. The Second War for Armageddon had begun, and the Imperium would soon learn that everything they thought they knew about fighting orcs was about to become obsolete. The initial landings caught the planetary defense forces completely by surprise, not just in their timing, but in their sophistication. This was not the disorganized mob that Imperial tacticians expected. Ghazghkull's forces struck at specific targets, securing key transportation hubs, disrupting communication networks, isolating strong points before attacking them. The orcs fought with discipline that shocked those who faced them, following orders, supporting each other, employing tactics that seemed impossible for creatures that were supposed to be little more than savage animals. The planetary governor at the time was a man named Hermann von Straub, and he was the worst possible leader for the crisis facing Armageddon. Arrogant, incompetent, and convinced that his world could handle any threat without help, von Straub actively interfered with attempts to call for reinforcement from the wider Imperium. He insisted that Armageddon's own forces would be sufficient, that calling for aid would be an admission of weakness that would damage his political standing. Officers who disagreed with him, who recognized the unprecedented danger, were reassigned or imprisoned for defeatism. One such officer was a commissar named Sebastian Jarek, an old veteran who had spent his entire life studying orc behavior and tactics. Jarek took one look at the invasion force and immediately recognized that this was no ordinary raid. The orcs were too organized, too directed, too purposeful. Jarek, defying von Straub's orders, managed to send messages through the system's astropaths, psychic communications that would take weeks to reach their destinations, but would eventually bring reinforcements. For this act of disobedience, von Straub banished Jarek to Hades' Hive, a massive city on Armageddon's equator, essentially sending him off to die when the orcs inevitably attacked. What von Straub did not understand, what he was constitutionally incapable of understanding, was that he had just sent the right man to the right place at the right time. Hades' Hive, one of Armageddon's largest and most heavily defended cities, would become the linchpin of the planet's defense, and Jarek, dismissed as a troublesome old man by the planetary government, would prove to be the only human on Armageddon capable of standing against Ghazghkull's tide. As Ghazghkull's forces swept across Armageddon, conquering territory at a pace that should have been impossible, the full scope of his strategic vision became clear. He was not simply attacking randomly, was not just destroying everything in his path for the sake of destruction. Instead, he was conducting a carefully planned campaign, one that showed a grasp of logistics and strategy that would have been impressive in an Imperial general and was absolutely terrifying in an orc warboss. First, Ghazghkull secured Armageddon's northern continent, using it as a staging ground and supply base. He set captured human populations to work stripping their own cities for raw materials, working them literally to death to feed the orc war machine. Mechs, those strange orcs with an innate understanding of technology, began building weapons, vehicles, airman fortifications at a furious pace. The green tide swelled as more orcs spawned from the spores that orcs naturally shed, their numbers growing faster than the defenders could kill them. Next, Ghazghkull began his push southward toward Armageddon Secundus, the heavily populated main continent where Hades' Hive stood. The planetary defense forces, trying desperately to slow the advance, threw regiment after regiment into the meat grinder, and regiment after regiment was destroyed. The orcs seemed unstoppable, rolling over defensive positions that should have held for weeks, bypassing strong points only to return and eliminate them at their leisure, demonstrating a level of tactical flexibility that Imperial commanders found deeply disturbing. But as the green tide approached Hades' Hive, it encountered something unexpected. Resistance. A real, organized, determined resistance led by a man who understood orcs better than anyone else on the planet. Jarek, given command of the Hive's defense through a combination of necessity and the complete absence of anyone better, had used his time to prepare. He had studied the orc advance, noted their patterns, identified their weaknesses. He knew that orcs, despite their fearsome reputation, could be beaten if you understood how they thought and were willing to pay the necessary price. Yarek's defense of Hades' Hive would become legendary, a textbook example of how to conduct urban warfare against a superior force. He turned the Hive itself into a fortress, blocking approaches, fortifying strong points, ensuring that every street would cost the orcs blood to take. Yet he inspired his troops through a combination of iron discipline and leading from the front, showing that he would never ask them to face dangers he would not face himself. And most importantly, he studied Ghazghkull, learning to anticipate the orc's tactics, to counter his strategies, to turn the Warboss's own intelligence against him. The siege of Hades' hive lasted for months, a grinding urban battle that consumed lives at a horrific rate. Ghazghkull, frustrated by Yarrick's stubborn defense, threw wave after wave of orcs at the hive's walls. Each assault was repelled, though at terrible cost. The defenders of Hades' hive were dying, being worn down by sheer attrition, but they refused to break. Yarrick, recognizing that they could not win by simple defense, began conducting raids and counterattacks, striking at orc supply lines, assassinating key leaders, disrupting Ghazghkull's carefully laid plans. During one particularly fierce assault, an orc warboss named Ghazghkull, one of Ghazghkull's most powerful subordinates, broke through the outer defenses and was advancing toward the hive's center. Yarrick, understanding that allowing such a powerful enemy to reach the civilian areas would be catastrophic, stepped forward to face Ghazghkull in single combat. The orc, massive and terrible, towered over the aging commissar. The two fought in the ruins of what had once been a commercial district, trading blows that should have killed either of them. Ghazghkull's power claw, a massive mechanical gauntlet capable of crushing tanks, caught Yarrick's right arm and severed it at the elbow. The pain should have been incapacitating, should have driven the commissar to his knees. And instead, Yarrick, driven by fury and absolutely refusing to die before Ghazghkull was defeated, swung his chainsword in a wide arc that caught Ghazghkull at the neck. The orc's head, separated from his body, rolled across the blood-stained ground. Yarrick, blood pouring from his severed arm, picked up Ghazghkull's power claw, lifted it high above his head, and roared his defiance at the orc army. The orcs, witnessing this display of savage courage, did something completely unexpected. They retreated, not routed, not fleeing in panic, but simply pulling back, as if the sight of this human standing over their fallen leader, with his own arm replaced by an orc weapon, was too much to process. Yarrick, only after the immediate danger had passed, allowed himself to collapse from blood loss. But the damage was done. The legend of Yarrick had been born, and from that moment on, the orcs of Armageddon would speak of Old Baali, with a mixture of fear and respect that they afforded to few humans. Eventually, inevitably, Ghazghkull himself joined the siege. The Warboss, frustrated by the stalemated campaign, came to Hades' hive determined to crush this irritating human resistance once and for all. He led an assault that dwarfed anything that had come before, throwing everything he had at the hive's defenses. The fighting reached a fever pitch, the dead piling up so high that they formed their own fortifications, the air thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. In the chaos of battle, Ghazghkull and Yarrick finally met face to face. The massive orc warboss and the elderly human commissar, surrounded by carnage, locked eyes across a ruined plaza. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, each recognizing in the other a worthy opponent. Someone who understood war not as random violence, but as an art form. Then they charged, two warriors who represented the ultimate expressions of their respective species, meeting in single combat while the battle raged around them. The details of that fight have been lost to history and legend, each retelling adding new embellishments and exaggerations. What is known for certain is that Yarrick, despite being smaller, older, and far less physically powerful than Ghazghkull, managed to hold his own. The commissar's skill, his understanding of how orcs fought, his absolute refusal to give up, allowed him to dance around attacks that would have killed him instantly, to find openings in Ghazghkull's massive armor, to inflict wounds that would have felled a lesser orc. But Ghazghkull was no ordinary orc. Each wound only seemed to make him fight harder. Each blow only increased his respect for this tenacious human. As the battle reached its climax, as both warriors approached the limits of their endurance, Ghazghkull managed to land a devastating strike that sent Yarrick flying across the plaza, broken and bleeding. The commissar, critically wounded, barely conscious, could only watch as the warboss approached to deliver the killing blow, and then, For reasons that Yarrick would never fully understand, Ghazghkull stopped. The orc stood over the fallen commissar, power claw raised, victory within his grasp. But instead of striking, he simply looked down at Yarrick with something that might have been respect in his alien eyes. Then, without a word, Ghazghkull turned and walked away, leaving Yarrick alive and allowing him to be recovered by his troops. That single act of mercy, or perhaps of calculated strategic thinking, would define the relationship between Ghazghkull and Yarrick for decades to come. But in the immediate aftermath, its effects were more practical. Yarrick's defense of Hades' hive, combined with his personal duel with Ghazghkull, had bought enough time for reinforcements to arrive. 3 Space Marine chapters, Blood Angels, Salamanders, and Ultramarines translated into the Armageddon system with their full strength, bringing with them the kind of military might that even Ghazghkull's massive horde could not withstand. The arrival of the Space Marines turned the tide of the war. These superhuman warriors, all genetically engineered to be the finest soldiers humanity could produce, crashed into the orc lines with devastating effect. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels led a campaign that pushed the orcs back from their positions in the south. The Salamanders, masters of flame and firepower, burned out orc strongholds that had seemed impregnable. The Ultramarines, with their tactical expertise and rigid discipline, systematically dismantled Ghazghkull's supply lines and command structure. Ghazghkull, recognizing that the situation had changed fundamentally, made a decision that would have been impossible for most orc warbosses. He retreated, not in panic or defeat, but in an organized withdrawal, taking his most valuable warriors and as much equipment as could be moved, leaving behind only those forces necessary to delay the Imperial counteroffensive. He understood, with a clarity that should have been impossible for an orc, that this battle was lost, but the war was far from over. As he withdrew to the World Killer and prepared to leave the Armageddon system, Ghazghkull took time to consider what he had learned. This campaign had been his first real test against the Imperium, and while he had not achieved total victory, he had learned invaluable lessons. He had learned about Imperial military capabilities, about how they would respond to large-scale orc invasions, about the weaknesses in their command structure and logistics. Most importantly, he had learned that there was at least one human, this Yarrick, who was worthy of respect and attention. Whilst the Second War for Armageddon ended with an Imperial victory, but it was a victory that came at tremendous cost. The planet's population had been decimated, its industrial capacity crippled, its cities reduced to ruins. The Imperium had been forced to commit 3 entire Space Marine chapters and countless Imperial Guard regiments to drive off a single orc invasion. And the fact that Ghazghkull had chosen to leave rather than being forced out was not lost on Imperial strategists. This had been a test, a reconnaissance in force, and everyone involved knew that Ghazghkull would be back. But for now, the Warboss had other concerns. The visions from Gork and Mork, which had never stopped since his initial awakening, were showing him new destinations, new battles, new conquests. He traveled through the galaxy, his fleet growing as he attracted more orcs to his banner, his reputation spreading across the stars. He fought battles on a dozen worlds, each victory adding to his legend, each conquest bringing him closer to the ultimate goal the gods had set for him. It was during this time that Ghazghkull began to develop what would become known as his Council of Warbosses, a command structure that allowed him to control multiple campaigns simultaneously. This was unprecedented in orc history. Typically, when an orc warboss died or moved on, his forces would fragment and disperse. But Ghazghkull had created something more permanent, something that would continue to function even in his absence. His greatest lieutenants, orcs who had proven their worth in battle and their loyalty to his vision, were given command of their own forces while remaining under his ultimate authority. Among these lieutenants was Nazdreg Ug Erdgrub, a Bad Moon's warboss who was unusual even among Ghazghkull's unusual followers. Nazdreg was not just wealthy by orc standards. He was genuinely intelligent, capable of speaking fluent Low Gothic and understanding human psychology well enough to effectively manage slaves and mercenaries. He commanded a space hulk called the Scylla of Bork, which his mechs had somehow managed to make partially controllable, and he used it to conduct raids across the galaxy with a level of strategic planning that rivaled human admirals. Another key member of Ghazghkull's inner circle was Boss Snikrot, a commando who had become a legend in his own right after spending decades fighting in the jungles of Armageddon. Snikrot and his Red Skull commandos specialized in stealth and assassination, skills that most orcs considered cowardly, but which Ghazghkull recognized as valuable tools. Where most orc warbosses led from the front with maximum noise and violence, Snikrot struck from the shadows, eliminating key targets and disrupting enemy command structures. But perhaps the most important of Ghazghkull's followers was not a mighty warboss or a cunning commando, but a lowly Gretchin named Makari. Gretchins are smaller, weaker cousins of orcs, typically used as slaves and cannon fodder, living short, brutal lives before being killed by their masters or eaten by something bigger. But Makari was different. Makari was, impossibly, lucky. Absurdly, ridiculously, impossibly lucky. Bullets aimed at him would miss. Buildings would collapse just after he had moved. Enemies would trip and fall at crucial moments. Makari survived situations that should have killed him 1,000 times over, and his luck seemed to extend to those around him. Ghazghkull, recognizing the value of such supernatural fortune, made Makari his personal banner-bearer, a position that kept the small Gretchin close to the warboss at all times. Some claimed that Makari was favored by Gork and Mork themselves, that his luck was a gift from the gods to aid Ghazghkull in his mission. Others suggested that Makari's presence was proof that Ghazghkull truly was a prophet, because who else but a chosen one would be accompanied by such an obviously blessed creature? The truth, as with so many things involving the orcs and their gods, was impossible to determine. Thus, what mattered was that Makari's presence seemed to make good things happen for Ghazghkull, and bad things happen to his enemies. During the decades following the Second War for Armageddon, Ghazghkull and Yarrick engaged in what could almost be called a dance, a series of encounters across multiple star systems that saw both warriors testing each other, learning from each other, developing a strange mutual respect that transcended species. Yarrick, obsessed with hunting down the orc who had humiliated the Imperium on Armageddon, followed Ghazghkull's trail across the galaxy. Ghazghkull, for his part, seemed almost to enjoy the pursuit, occasionally leaving clues or making his movements easier to track, as if he wanted Yarrick to find him. The inevitable confrontation came on a planet called Golgotha, a desolate world that Ghazghkull had conquered from the squats, those squat, hardy abhuman miners who had once been allied with the Imperium. Yarrick, leading a strike force of Imperial Guard, launched what he thought would be a lightning raid to kill Ghazghkull and destroy his growing war machine. But Ghazghkull had been expecting him, had prepared the battlefield in advance, and the Imperial forces walked into a trap that cost them dearly. The Battle of Golgotha was a disaster for the Imperium. Yarrick's forces were surrounded and cut off, their vehicles destroyed, their supply lines severed. One by one, the Imperial Guardsmen fell, fighting to the last, but overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Yarrick himself, refusing to surrender or retreat, fought until he was finally captured, his personal Baneblade tank destroyed around him, his body broken and bleeding. Ghazghkull could have killed Yarrick then, should have killed him, by every tactical consideration, but instead, the warboss ordered his captive taken aboard his command ship, the mighty Kill Wrecker, which had been upgraded and expanded in the decades since leaving Urk. Yarrick, expecting torture and death, instead found himself subjected to weeks of interrogation that was surprisingly civil by orc standards. Ghazghkull spoke to him, not as a captor to a prisoner, but as one general to another, discussing tactics and strategy, showing genuine interest in understanding how humans thought about war. During one of these conversations, Ghazghkull revealed something that shocked Yarrick to his core. The Warboss explained, in broken but comprehensible Gothic, that he was planning to return to Armageddon, that he was gathering the largest orc horde the galaxy had seen in millennia, that he wanted Yarrick to lead the Imperial defense, because what was the point of conquering a world if the fight wasn't challenging? Ghazghkull wanted a war that would last, a conflict worthy of his status as the prophet of Gork and Mork, and for that he needed an opponent who would make it interesting. Then, to Yarrick's complete astonishment, Ghazghkull had him released. The Warboss had Mad Doc Grotznik repair the damage the Commissar had suffered during his capture, even reinstalling the bionics that had been removed, and then simply let him go. Yarrick, standing on the surface of Golgotha watching his transport ship descend to collect him, swore an oath that he would make Ghazghkull regret this mercy, whilst that he would dedicate the rest of his life to killing this orc who had twice shown him undeserved kindness. Exactly 57 years to the day after the end of the Second War for Armageddon, Ghazghkull made good on his promise. He returned to the system at the head of an armada that dwarfed his previous invasion fleet, bringing with him orcs from dozens of worlds, every major clan represented, every type of orc warrior present in overwhelming numbers. The Third War for Armageddon had begun, and this time Ghazghkull was not simply raiding. This time, he meant to conquer the planet completely and use it as the foundation for his greater crusade. The initial assault was devastating beyond anything the Imperium had prepared for. Ghazghkull's first action was to obliterate Hades' hive from orbit, reducing the city that had been the symbol of Imperial resistance to a smoldering crater. But Yarrick, who had indeed been placed in command of Armageddon's defense, had anticipated this. He had evacuated Hades' hive before the bombardment, moving its population and military assets to other locations, refusing to let sentiment or pride prevent him from making the tactically correct decision. The war that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had seen in living memory. Ghazghkull threw everything he had at Armageddon, and the Imperium responded with equal ferocity. The Blood Angels returned, this time led by their chapter master, Dante himself. The Salamanders sent their full strength. The Ultramarines committed a significant portion of their forces. Dozens of Imperial Guard regiments, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, were shipped to Armageddon to hold the line against the Green Tide. The planet itself became a massive battlefield, every hive city a fortress, every stretch of wasteland a killing ground. Ghazghkull demonstrated tactical innovations that shocked Imperial strategists. He employed submarines, of all things, using them to attack coastal cities that thought themselves safe from assault. He built teleportation devices that could transport entire mobs of orcs directly into enemy strongholds, bypassing defenses entirely. His mechs constructed war machines that rivaled Imperial Titans in size and firepower. And through it all, Ghazghkull commanded his forces with a level of strategic coherence that should have been impossible for an orc to maintain across such a massive front. But as the months turned into years, and as the casualties mounted on both sides, Ghazghkull began to feel something unusual for an orc. He began to feel bored. The visions from Gork and Mork, which had quieted somewhat during the early stages of the war, began to return with increasing frequency. They showed him other battles, other conquests, other orc warbosses who needed to be brought under his command. The gods were telling him that Armageddon, as glorious as the fighting was only one small part of their grand plan. They wanted him to move on, to begin the true work of uniting every orc in the galaxy. The decision to leave Armageddon, to abandon a war he had started, was one that would have destroyed any other orc warboss's reputation. Orcs respect strength and winning, and leaving a battlefield before achieving total victory should have been seen as weakness. But such was Ghazghkull's authority, so complete was his control over his followers, that when he announced he was departing to pursue greater conquests, his warbosses simply nodded and continued the fight in his name. He left the Third War for Armageddon to his lieutenants, confident that they would maintain the pressure on the Imperium, while he pursued the visions the gods had given him. Ghazghkull boarded the kill wrecker and departed Armageddon, but he was not alone. Yarick, obsessed with finishing what had become a decades-long rivalry, assembled a fleet and gave chase. Joining him was High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars Space Marine chapter, who had his own reasons for wanting Ghazghkull dead. The pursuit lasted for months, as a deadly game of cat and mouse across multiple star systems, as Ghazghkull tried to reach his next destination, and the Imperial forces tried to corner him and end his threat permanently. The confrontation finally came in a desolate region of space called the Haunted Gulf, a place where the Imperium pressed close to reality, and strange things happened even by the standards of the 41st Millennium. Ghazghkull's fleet, outnumbered and outgunned, turned to make a stand. The battle that followed was apocalyptic in its violence, both sides pouring fire into each other with abandon. Imperial battleships traded broadsides with Orc kill cruisers, space itself burning with the energy of countless weapons discharges. The Kill Wrecker, Ghazghkull's command ship, took terrible damage but refused to die. The Warboss himself, standing on his bridge surrounded by his inner circle, could feel the ship dying around him. But he could also feel something else. The Weird Boys, those psychically sensitive Orcs who channeled the collective power of the Orc race, were doing something unprecedented. They were gathering energy, building to a crescendo that would either save them all or destroy them. Then, just as the Imperial forces were preparing to board the crippled Kill Wrecker, a wave of green energy erupted from the ship. It was psychic force made manifest, the collective will of billions of Orcs channeled through Ghazghkull and his psychically sensitive followers. The energy washed over the Imperial ships, shutting down their systems, leaving them dead in space and unable to pursue. And before the Imperials could recover, or before they could restart their systems and continue the fight, the Kill Wrecker disappeared. It simply ceased to exist in real space, pulled into the warp by forces that the Imperials could not understand or counter. The Kill Wrecker emerged from the Imperium in the Octarius sector, a region of space that had been controlled by Orcs for thousands of years. But this was not a friendly arrival. Octarius was currently embroiled in a massive war between the local Orc Empire, led by a powerful Warboss, who called himself the Overfiend of Octarius, and a tendril of Hive Fleet Leviathan, one of the largest Tyranid swarms ever encountered. The conflict had been raging for years, consuming resources and lives at a rate that should have exhausted both sides, but instead seemed only to intensify with each passing day. A Ghazghkull saw Octarius not as a problem, but as an opportunity. Here was a war that had drawn in millions of Orcs from across the sector. Here was a conflict that would either produce countless battle-hardened veterans or clear out the weak and unworthy. Here was a chance to demonstrate his power, to show every Orc in Octarius why he was the chosen prophet of Gork and Mork. His first action in the Octarius sector was to challenge a rival warboss named Urgok the Slayer, who commanded a significant portion of the Orc forces in the region. Ghazghkull did not send messengers or diplomats. Instead, he simply teleported directly into Urgok's throne room with a squad of his most elite warriors. The fight that followed was brief and brutal, with Ghazghkull demonstrating why he was considered the greatest Orc warboss alive. Urgok, faced with either death or submission, chose submission, and his forces were absorbed into Ghazghkull's growing army. Then Ghazghkull turned his attention to the Tyranids. The battle that followed would become legendary in Orc oral history, sung about in countless victory chants across the galaxy. Ghazghkull led his forces directly into the heart of the Tyranid swarm, fighting creatures that could devour entire worlds. He personally killed a Morlock, one of the massive burrowing organisms the Tyranids used to attack from below, by allowing himself to be swallowed and then cutting his way out from the inside with his power claw. The image of Ghazghkull emerging from the corpse of a Morlock, covered in acid and ichor, but still very much alive and ready to fight, became iconic. Through months of brutal fighting, Ghazghkull drove the Tyranids back, not because his tactics were sophisticated, though they were, and not because his warriors were individually stronger than the Tyranid organisms, though they were tough, but because Ghazghkull understood something fundamental about both species. The Tyranids and the Orcs were both locked into evolutionary warfare, each side adapting and growing stronger through conflict. What Ghazghkull had created in Octarius was not a victory, but a perpetual war machine, a conflict that would never truly end and would continue to produce stronger and stronger warriors on both sides. With the Tyranid threat contained, if not eliminated, Ghazghkull turned his attention to the Overfiend of Octarius, the local orc leader who had ruled the sector for decades. The Overfiend, at whose true name was lost to history, but whose reputation for cunning and strength was well established, had watched Ghazghkull's actions with growing alarm. He could see that this newcomer was not just another rival to be defeated, but a genuine threat to his authority, possibly even a being who could unite the orcs of Octarius under a single banner. The confrontation between Ghazghkull and the Overfiend was anticlimactic in its brevity. When the two warbosses met, surrounded by their respective entourages, the Overfiend took one look at Ghazghkull and saw something in his eyes that made even that hardened veteran pause. Perhaps it was the absolute certainty, the unshakable belief that he was destined to unite all orcs. Perhaps it was the visible signs of divine favor, the adamantium skull that had saved his life and awakened his visions. Perhaps it was simply the raw psychic presence that Ghazghkull now projected, the weight of Gork and Mork's attention pressing down on anyone who stood near him. Whatever the reason, the Overfiend of Octarius, ruler of a star empire, commander of billions of orcs, looked at Ghazghkull and chose to kneel. He swore allegiance, not out of fear, but out of recognition that he was in the presence of something greater than himself, something that transcended normal orc politics and power struggles. In that moment, Ghazghkull's great crusade truly began. For the first time in 8,000 years, orcs from multiple empires were united under a single leader with a single purpose. Word of Ghazghkull's actions in Octarius spread across the galaxy at the speed of thought, carried by the strange psychic network that connects all orcs. Other warbosses began to hear whispers of a prophet who spoke with the gods, of a leader who could unite the clans, of a war that would dwarf anything that had come before. Some dismissed these rumors as the usual orc boasting, exaggerations and lies told to make someone seem more impressive than they actually were. But others began to feel a pull, an irresistible urge to travel toward Octarius, to see this Ghazghkull for themselves, and perhaps join his cause. When Ghazghkull finally left the Octarius sector, he commanded a fleet of over 5 million ships, ranging from massive space hulks to tiny fighters cobbled together from scrap. It was the largest orc armada assembled since the War of the Beast in M32. As an invasion force that represented an existential threat to any region of space it approached. Imperial strategists, tracking this massive fleet through astropathic reports and long-range sensors, began to panic. If Ghazghkull turned this force against any major Imperial world, the damage would be catastrophic. But the most disturbing reports came from the Imperium's intelligence networks. Multiple sources, independent of each other and separated by vast distances, reported sighting Ghazghkull in different locations at the same time. He was documented fighting on Armageddon, giving his followers tactical advice through some kind of psychic communication. He was spotted leading forces near the Forge world of Ryza. Reports came in of his presence in the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off by the Great Rift. And he was seen sacking the planet Cantissa and simultaneously fighting on the killing fields of Aurochtha. The explanation that eventually emerged was terrifying in its implications. Ghazghkull had somehow learned to use the chaotic nature of the warp to his advantage, employing warp storms and reality-bending phenomena to essentially be in multiple places at once. Whether through extreme time dilation, psychic projection, or simply the universe breaking down under the weight of so much orc belief, the result was the same. Ghazghkull had become effectively omnipresent, able to command battles across the entire galaxy simultaneously. The orcs, already inspired by his legend, took this as proof that he truly was the prophet of their gods, a being who transcended normal limitations of space and time. It was during this period of expansion, as Ghazghkull's great crusade gathered momentum, that he encountered one of the few forces in the galaxy capable of threatening even him. The Space Wolves, Space Marine chapter, known for their ferocity and their willingness to pursue objectives that other chapters considered too dangerous, had decided that Ghazghkull represented an unacceptable threat. Under the leadership of Wolf Lord Ragnar Blackmane, one of the youngest and most aggressive commanders in the chapter, the Space Wolves launched a campaign specifically designed to kill Ghazghkull and decapitate his growing empire. The campaign led them to a planet called Krongar, a world that Ghazghkull was using as a staging ground for his next offensive. Ragnar, accompanied by only a small force of his most elite warriors, has infiltrated the planet and fought his way through countless orcs to reach Ghazghkull himself. The confrontation between the young space wolf and the ancient orc warboss should have been completely one-sided. Ghazghkull was larger, stronger, protected by armor that had turned aside weapons that would have destroyed tanks. Ragnar was, despite his considerable skill, still just one space marine. But Ragnar Blackmane was not just any space marine. He was a warrior who had earned his position through countless battles, who had faced down horrors that would have broken lesser men, who possessed a berserker fury that rivaled even the orcs' love of violence. When the two warriors met in the ruins of an imperial cathedral, it was not a battle, but a clash of wills. The two beings who represented the absolute pinnacle of their respective species, trying to prove which of them was superior. The duel raged for hours, neither warrior able to gain a decisive advantage. Ghazghkull's power claw crushed through ceramite armor, his massive strength threatening to break the space marine in half. Ragnar's frostblade, a weapon that could freeze and shatter armor on contact, scored countless wounds on the orc's body. The cathedral around them collapsed from the violence of their fight, but still they continued, too stubborn or too focused to acknowledge that they were both being driven to the limits of their endurance. Finally, in a moment that would be debated and analyzed for years to come, Ragnar managed to accomplish what so many had tried and failed to do. He severed Ghazghkull's head. At the Wolf Lord's frostblade, cutting through hydraulic cables and armor plating, took the warboss's head clean off his shoulders. Ragnar, using the last of his strength, lifted the severed head high and howled his victory to the heavens. But Ghazghkull, even in death, had one final surprise. As Ragnar held his head aloft, the warboss's power claw closed around the space wolf's body. The crushing force, activated by dying nerve impulses, or perhaps simple orc stubbornness, broke Ragnar's back, shattered his ribs, and left the Wolf Lord on the edge of death. Both warriors collapsed, their epic duel ending not with a clear victor, but with mutual destruction. Ragnar's battle brothers managed to recover him, barely alive, and rushed him into stasis for transport back to their fortress. The Space Wolves, believing they had finally killed Ghazghkull, celebrated their victory, even as they mourned the critical condition of their Wolf Lord. To save Ragnar's life, the chapter's apothecaries were forced to perform the dangerous Rubicon Primaris operation, transforming him from a traditional space marine into one of the new Primaris marines with their enhanced physiology. For 10 days, Ragnar lingered between life and death, his body reconstructed on a cellular level. Meanwhile, Ghazghkull's followers recovered his body. Mad Doc Grotznik, who had accompanied his oldest patient on this campaign, took one look at the separated head and body and saw not a disaster, but an opportunity. For days, Grotznik worked in his mobile surgery, a massive vehicle equipped with every piece of medical equipment the Mad Doc had accumulated over centuries. Whilst the other orcs, watching the surgery continue for far longer than any normal orc operation, began to whisper that perhaps their prophet truly was dead, that perhaps Gork and Mork had abandoned them. But Grotznik, working with an inspiration that bordered on divine, was doing something unprecedented. He could not simply reattach the head to the original body. The damage was too extensive. the neck too destroyed. Instead, he decided to attach Ghazghkull's head to an entirely new body, or more accurately, to build a new body around the head. Using materials salvaged from destroyed vehicles, armor taken from fallen orcs, and technology that shouldn't have been possible with orc engineering, Grotznik created something that was more machine than orc, but still undeniably alive. The surgery was nearly complete when a group of ambitious knobs, all sensing opportunity, broke into Grotznik's surgery. They intended to kill both the Mad Doc and the comatose Warboss, to seize control of Ghazghkull's forces for themselves. But their timing was imperfect. As they grabbed Grotznik and prepared to finish their coup, Ghazghkull's eyes snapped open. The reborn Warboss, his head now mounted on a massive suit of armor that made him even larger and more terrifying than before, rose from the operating table and made short work of the would-be usurpers. When Ragnar Blackmane finally recovered from his own surgery and returned to active duty, he was horrified to learn that Ghazghkull still lived. The Space Wolves, refusing to accept defeat, launched another assault on Krongar, this time attempting to redirect an orbital station to crash into the planet's surface, where Ghazghkull was located. The station, hundreds of tons of metal and machinery, screamed through the atmosphere and impacted near Ghazghkull's position with force equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. The explosion was visible from orbit, a massive crater marking where the station had hit. But when the dust settled and Imperial forces moved in to confirm the kill, Ghazghkull was gone. Whether he had escaped before the impact, survived through sheer toughness, or been somehow protected by the orc gods themselves, the result was the same. The beast of Armageddon lived, and now he was angrier and more determined than ever to complete his mission. The resurrection of Ghazghkull, his transformation into an even more powerful form, sent shockwaves through both the orc and Imperial communities. For the orcs, it was proof beyond any doubt that Ghazghkull truly was blessed by Gork and Mork, that nothing could kill their prophet, because the gods themselves protected him. For the Imperium, it was a nightmare scenario, an enemy who had already been nearly impossible to stop, now enhanced and augmented beyond their worst predictions. But what truly set Ghazghkull apart from every other orc warboss, living or dead, was not his size or his strength, or even his apparent immortality. It was his mind. The adamantium plate that Mad Doc Grotznik had grafted to his skull all those centuries ago had done something to Ghazghkull's brain, whether awakening latent psychic powers, rewiring his neural pathways, or simply providing a conduit for the orc gods to speak through him more clearly. The result was an orc who could think in ways that should have been impossible for his species. Most orcs live entirely in the present moment. They fight because they enjoy fighting, because it's what they're good at, because the concept of not fighting simply doesn't occur to them. They have no long-term planning beyond find enemy, hit enemy, repeat. They don't build lasting empires or establish permanent structures. When a warboss dies, his territory fragments and disperses, absorbed by other warbosses, or simply reverting to anarchy until a new strong leader emerges. But Ghazghkull could see beyond the next fight. He could plan decades in advance, setting up supply lines and logistics networks that would support campaigns lasting years. He understood concepts like strategic reserve, operational security, intelligence gathering, but he could read his enemies, predicting their movements and countering their strategies before they could be implemented. When he spoke, he could articulate complex tactical concepts in ways that other orcs could understand and implement, translating sophisticated military theory into simple, actionable orders. More importantly, Ghazghkull understood psychology, both orc and human. He knew how to inspire loyalty in his followers, not through fear, but through genuine respect and the belief that they were part of something greater than themselves. He knew how to demoralize his enemies, using psychological warfare in ways that most orcs would never consider. His decision to spare Yarrick, to build up a rivalry with the Commissar over decades, and created a legend that served Ghazghkull's purposes far better than simply killing the human would have. The adamantium skull itself had become a symbol, instantly recognizable to friend and enemy alike. Imperial propaganda tried to downplay its significance, claiming it was just a metal plate, nothing more. But every orc who saw Ghazghkull knew better. The skull represented survival against impossible odds, the favor of the gods made manifest, the transformation from ordinary warrior to chosen prophet. It was a visual reminder that Ghazghkull was different, that he had been marked for greatness by forces beyond mortal understanding. Ghazghkull's psychic abilities, awakened or enhanced by his injury and subsequent surgery, manifested in ways that were subtle but profound. He could sense concentrations of orcs across vast distances, knowing instinctively where large numbers of his species had gathered. This ability allowed him to navigate the galaxy with uncanny accuracy, always finding new sources of recruits for his growing crusade. He could project his presence through the warp, appearing in visions and dreams to orcs hundreds of light years away, inspiring them to join his cause. Most remarkably, Ghazghkull could speak Gothic, the common language of the Imperium. Not perfectly. His accent was thick, and his grammar often questionable, but well enough to communicate complex ideas to humans. This ability, almost unheard of among orcs, allowed him to negotiate with human slaves, to understand captured Imperial documents, to listen in on enemy communications, and glean intelligence that other orc warbosses would never have access to. It also terrified Imperial forces. Well, because an orc who could speak your language was an orc who could understand your tactics, your strategies, your weaknesses. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Ghazghkull's nature was something that existed purely in the realm of belief and collective consciousness. The orcs as a species have a strange relationship with reality. Their technology works, not because it follows physical laws, but because they believe it should work. Their weapons are more powerful when they believe they're powerful. Their vehicles go faster when painted red, because red is a lucky color. This collective belief, channeled through the warp by the latent psychic power all orcs possess, actually reshapes reality to match their expectations. Ghazghkull, as the focus of billions of orcs' belief and devotion, had become something more than just an individual orc. He had become an idea, a concept given physical form. Orcs across the galaxy believed that he was the chosen prophet of Gork and Mork, that he was destined to unite the greenskin race, that he could not be killed because the gods protected him. And because they believed these things with such fervor, with such absolute certainty, reality itself began to bend to accommodate their belief. Ghazghkull's wounds healed faster than they should. His plans succeeded more often than probability would suggest. His enemies made mistakes at crucial moments. He was lucky in ways that transcended mere coincidence, and that luck was powered by the faith of every orc who chanted his name before battle. The scope of Ghazghkull's influence on orc society cannot be overstated. Before his rise, as the greenskins were a persistent problem for the Imperium, but not an existential threat, orc invasions would sweep through a few systems, burn themselves out, and recede. They could be contained, managed, even exploited by clever Imperial commanders who would manipulate orc aggression toward other enemies. The standard Imperial response to an orc incursion was measured, predictable, based on thousands of years of experience fighting the greenskins. But Ghazghkull changed everything. He proved that orcs were not just mindless barbarians, but could be molded into a strategic threat that required the Imperium's full attention. The wars he waged were not simple smash-and-grab raids, but carefully orchestrated campaigns that threatened to overwhelm entire sectors. The organization he imposed on his forces, the discipline he demanded, as the strategic vision he provided, all of these elevated the orc threat to a level not seen since the War of the Beast 8,000 years ago. More worrying still was the example he set for other orc warbosses. Across the galaxy, young orcs who heard tales of Ghazghkull began to emulate him. to try to think more strategically, to aspire to unite their own clans under a single purpose. Not all of them succeeded. Most failed spectacularly, but enough demonstrated increased sophistication that Imperial strategists began to worry about a galaxy-wide evolution in Orc military capability. It was as if Ghazghkull's very existence was raising the baseline intelligence of the entire species. The comparison to the beast was inevitable and deeply unsettling. The beast had been an Orc warboss who had nearly destroyed the Imperium in M32, leading a crusade that had conquered thousands of worlds and brought the greenskins to the gates of terror itself. The crisis had been so severe that the Imperium had been forced to mobilize every available resource, founding new Space Marine chapters and developing new weapons specifically to counter the beast's threat. And even then, victory had come at tremendous cost, with entire chapters destroyed and the Imperium's eastern territories permanently destabilized. Ghazghkull's name, Mag Uruk Thraka, translated roughly to I am slaughter, eerily similar to the beast's own title. His tactical sophistication, his ability to unite disparate Orc clans, his apparent immortality, all these paralleled the beast's own capabilities. The fear among Imperial High Command was that Ghazghkull was not just similar to the beast, but was perhaps becoming the next beast, evolving into something that would threaten not just individual worlds or sectors, but the entire Imperium itself. The current status of Ghazghkull and his Great Crusade represents an ongoing crisis for the Imperium of Man. His fleet of over 5 million ships is not a static force, but a growing one, constantly reinforced by Orcs who hear of his legend and travel to join him. Every battle he fights, whether victory or defeat, attracts more followers, because Orcs are drawn to the promise of good fights, and Ghazghkull offers the best fights in the galaxy. As his presence at Armageddon has transformed that world into what the Orcs call a holy site, a place where greenskins from across the stars make pilgrimage to test themselves in battle against the Imperium's defenders. The multiple simultaneous sightings of Ghazghkull across different sectors of the galaxy are not glitches or errors, but seem to be genuine manifestations of his will. Through some combination of psychic projection, warp-based travel, and the reality-bending effects of Orc belief, Ghazghkull has achieved a form of omnipresence. He can appear on Armageddon to inspire his followers there, then manifest in the Octarius sector to command operations against the Tyranids, then show up near Risa to lead an assault on that Forge world. Each appearance is brief, lasting only long enough to provide tactical guidance or inspiration. But the cumulative effect is that Ghazghkull seems to be everywhere at once. The visions that Ghazghkull receives from Gork and Mork, which have guided him since his resurrection on Grotznik's operating table, continue to drive his actions. These visions show him a galaxy united under Orc rule, every star system echoing with the sound of battle, every world transformed into a paradise of endless warfare. They show him gathering every Orc in existence under his banner, forging them into a single unstoppable crusade that will sweep across reality itself. Most ominously, the vision suggests that when this unity is achieved, Gork and Mork themselves will tear their way out of the warp to join the fight, leading their children in a final battle that will reshape the galaxy. Whether these visions are real prophecies, psychic delusions, or something in between matters less than the fact that Ghazghkull believes them absolutely. And because he believes, millions of Orcs believe with him. They fight not just for the joy of fighting, but for a higher purpose, a destiny written in the stars themselves. This sense of purpose, this belief in a greater cause, transforms what would otherwise be random violence into a directed, coordinated threat that the Imperium has no counter for. The Imperium's response to Ghazghkull has been hampered by the simple fact that they don't know how to kill him. Conventional assassination attempts have failed, as infiltrating his inner circle is nearly impossible, and getting close enough to strike is suicidal. Orbital bombardment has proven ineffective, yet as Ghazghkull seems to have an uncanny ability to not be where you think he is when the missiles arrive. Even decapitation, the most decisive form of killing, has proven insufficient, as Ragnar Blackmane discovered to his cost. If cutting off Ghazghkull's head doesn't kill him, what will? The truth is that Ghazghkull may have transcended the point where he can be killed in any conventional sense. He has become an idea as much as a person, a symbol that exists in the collective consciousness of every orc in the galaxy. Even if his physical body were destroyed completely, the belief in his return, in his immortality, in his destiny, might be sufficient to resurrect him again. The orcs would simply refuse to accept that their prophet was dead, and that refusal, backed by psychic power, might be enough to make it true. The strategic situation facing the Imperium is dire. Ghazghkull's Great Crusade represents a threat on multiple levels simultaneously. On Armageddon, the Third War continues to consume resources at an unsustainable rate, tying down forces that are desperately needed elsewhere. In Octarius, the conflict between orcs and Tyranids has created a meat grinder that is producing increasingly dangerous variants of both species. Throughout the galaxy, smaller orc incursions inspired by Ghazghkull's example are putting pressure on Imperial worlds that were previously secure. And at the center of it all is Ghazghkull himself, coordinating these disparate threats into a coherent strategy that threatens to overwhelm the Imperium's ability to respond. The comparison to the Horus heresy, while perhaps hyperbolic, is not entirely without merit. Here Horus nearly destroyed the Imperium through force of arms and strategic brilliance, leading traitor forces that came within a hair's breadth of conquering Terra itself. Ghazghkull's threat is different in nature, but potentially equal in scope. Where Horus commanded traitor space marines and demonic allies, Ghazghkull commands a species that outnumbers humanity by orders of magnitude and can spawn new warriors from fungal spores at a rate that makes replacing casualties trivial. Where Horus sought to kill the Emperor and claim his throne, Ghazghkull seeks something even more ambitious, to reshape the entire galaxy into an endless battlefield where orcs reign supreme. The irony of Ghazghkull's existence is that he represents everything the orcs could be if they were ever properly organized and directed. And the greenskin species has always had incredible potential for violence and conquest. Individual orcs are physically superior to baseline humans, regenerate from wounds that would kill other species, grow larger and stronger the more they fight. Their technology, while crude, is strangely effective and can be produced at a fraction of the cost and time of Imperial equivalents. Their natural aggression makes them fearless soldiers who don't need to be trained or motivated. They simply do what comes naturally to them. The only thing that has prevented the orcs from conquering the galaxy before now was their own disorganization. They fought among themselves as much as they fought their enemies. They lacked strategic vision, preferring immediate gratification over long-term goals. Their leadership was unstable, warbosses rising and falling based on who could hit the hardest rather than who could think the clearest. Ghazghkull, by providing organization without eliminating the fundamental orc nature, by giving them strategic direction while still allowing them to enjoy fighting, has unlocked that potential in a way that should terrify any rational observer. The question that haunts Imperial strategists, the nightmare scenario that keeps Lord Commanders awake at night, is simple. What happens if Ghazghkull succeeds? What happens if he actually manages to unite every orc in the galaxy under his banner? The combined might of such a force would be unstoppable by any conventional means. The Imperium, already overstretched and fighting on 1,000 fronts against 12 different enemies, could not possibly withstand an assault by every orc in existence acting in concert. Even if every Space Marine chapter mobilized, even if every Imperial Guard regiment was recalled, even if the Mechanicus deployed every weapon in their arsenals, it might not be enough. And yet, there's a darker possibility that some theorists have begun to whisper about in the most secure chambers of Imperial intelligence. What if Ghazghkull winning is exactly what Gork and Mork want? What if the ultimate goal of the Orc gods is not to conquer the galaxy, but to ignite a war so massive, so all-consuming, that it tears down the barriers between reality and the warp? The visions Ghazghkull speaks of, visions of Gork and Mork manifesting physically in real space, suggest an endgame that goes beyond mere conquest. If the Orc gods themselves enter the material universe, the resulting psychic upheaval could make the birth of Slaanesh look like a minor disturbance. The tragedy, if one can apply such a human concept to an Orc, is that Ghazghkull might have been stopped if someone had simply killed him when he was young, before he rose to power. That nameless Orc boy, staggering through the ruins with his skull blown apart, could have been left to die and no one would have missed him. Mad Doc Grotznik could have decided the surgery was too difficult and left his patient on the scrap heap. Dregmek could have killed Ghazghkull during their first confrontation, rather than underestimating the young upstart. At any of these points, history could have taken a different path. Oh, and the galaxy would have been spared the nightmare of facing the prophet of the Green Gods. But that's not what happened. Ghazghkull survived, not through skill or planning, but through accident and the bizarre whims of Orc biology. He rose to power not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he had vision and the ability to make others see that vision. He became a prophet, not through any divine appointment, but because he believed with such absolute certainty that he had been chosen, and that belief became contagious. And now, centuries later, he stands as perhaps the single greatest threat to human civilization, since the Emperor himself was interred on the Golden Throne. The oldest living Orc Warboss in the galaxy, the Beast of Armageddon, the Prophet of Gork and Mork. Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka represents everything humanity fears about the Xenos races that surround them. He is proof that the Imperium's enemies are not mindless monsters to be swept aside, but intelligent, adaptable beings who can learn and evolve. He is evidence that even the lowliest alien, given the right circumstances, can rise to threaten the greatest empire humanity has ever built. And most terrifyingly, he is a reminder that the galaxy is not humanity's by right, that any day could bring forth a new threat that renders all previous achievements meaningless. As the 41st millennium draws toward its close, as the cicatrix maledictum tears the galaxy in half, and 1,000 new horrors emerge from the darkness, Ghazghkull continues his great crusade. His fleet grows larger with each passing day. Yet his legend spreads farther with each victory. His power increases as more Orcs come to believe in his destiny. Somewhere out there in the void, aboard the mighty Kill Wrecker, or perhaps manifesting simultaneously across a dozen different battlefields, Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka pursues the vision given to him by gods that may or may not exist. And the Imperium, stretched thin and besieged on all sides, can only watch and pray that someone, somewhere, finds a way to stop him before it's too late. Because if they don't, if Ghazghkull succeeds in his mission, the galaxy will burn beneath a green tide that will never recede, and humanity's 10,000-year struggle for survival will end not with a bang, but with the sound of countless Orc voices raised in savage celebration of their prophet's ultimate victory. So, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the life and times of the most dangerous Orc to ever live, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.